The morning dew clung to the sharpened coils of barbed wire, catching the first golden rays of an Iowa sunrise. Beyond the fence line, farmland stretched as far as the eye could see, corn stalks swaying gently in the autumn breeze. Inside the camp, silence hung heavy as prisoners shuffled from their barracks, eyes downcast, minds still trapped in the desert sands of North Africa where they had fought and ultimately surrendered. Karl Mueller, 23 years old and formerly a tank commander in Rommel's Afrika Korps, blinked against the brightness of the American morning, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the unfamiliar prisoner uniform. The journey across the Atlantic had been long, the fear palpable among the captured German soldiers. Stories had circulated between them during those dark nights at sea, whispered accounts of what awaited prisoners of war in American hands: torture, starvation, forced labor until death. These were the certainties they had carried with them, reinforced by years of Nazi propaganda films showing Allied brutality. Yet something else entirely awaited them at Camp Clarinda, something so unexpected that Karl found himself unable to process it fully. Each night since their arrival, the prisoners had been given clean cotton sheets for their beds. Not rough burlap sacks stuffed with straw, not bare metal frames where exhausted men collapsed after 18-hour work shifts, but actual beds with mattresses and pillows, covered in white linens that smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. Each morning, Karl would wake to find himself wrapped in this impossible comfort, momentarily forgetting his status as a prisoner, before reality crashed back in. The sheets were changed weekly, taken away to be laundered and replaced with fresh ones. This simple act, this routine exchange of clean fabric, had begun to shake the foundations of everything Karl believed about America, about the war, about the stories he had been told since childhood. "Why would they waste such luxury on the enemy?" he whispered to his bunkmate, Hans Werner, a former Luftwaffe mechanic from Dresden. "There must be some purpose to it, some trick we haven't yet discovered." Hans merely shrugged, running his fingers over the crisp edge of his perfectly tucked sheet. "Perhaps they wish to show us how rich they are, how little this war has cost them compared to Germany." His voice dropped lower. "Or perhaps this is simply how they live, even in wartime." That possibility was almost too disturbing to contemplate. As Karl lined up for morning roll call, the autumn sun warming his back, he found himself haunted not by the fence that contained him, but by the softness of the bed that awaited him that night. It was a small thing, this provision of clean sheets, yet it had begun to unravel something deep within him, a thread that, once pulled, threatened to unwind the entire fabric of his belief in German superiority. He had been prepared for cruelty. The unexpected kindness felt like a different kind of violence altogether, one that attacked not his body, but the very certainties that had carried him through the war. The American guards moved casually along the perimeter, rifles held loosely, voices calm as they called out instructions. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots polished, their faces fuller and healthier than any German soldier Karl had seen in years. Even their posture seemed different, less rigid, more relaxed, yet no less effective. Like men who have never known real hunger, Karl thought to himself. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Iowa sky, illuminating the vast agricultural bounty beyond the camp, the German prisoners began another day of captivity, wrapped in a confusion more profound than any barbed wire could create. That first night in Camp Clarinda remained etched in Karl's memory like a fever dream. After processing, the photographs, the questions, the medical examinations, the prisoners had been marched to barracks that resembled summer camp lodgings more than prison cells. Inside, rows of beds stood in neat lines, each made up with a precision that would have satisfied even the strictest German officer. Blue wool blankets were folded at perfect right angles. White sheets stretched taut across each mattress, not a wrinkle to be seen. Pillows, actual pillows with cotton cases, rested at the head of each bed. The prisoners had stood frozen, uncertain whether this was some elaborate psychological trick. "Move along now," the American guard had said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Pick a bunk. Lights out in 30 minutes. The Germans had moved cautiously, each selecting a bed with the wariness of men expecting some hidden trap. Carl had sat gingerly on the edge of his assigned bunk, the springs creaking slightly beneath his weight. The mattress gave way, soft yet supportive, nothing like the hard ground of North Africa or the swaying hammocks of the transport ship. When he finally lay down, the clean cotton sheets had enveloped him in a coolness that made his exhausted body sink deeper, as though the bed itself were pulling him into a surrender more complete than any battlefield defeat. "Is this how they treat all prisoners?" whispered Franz Lehmann from the next bunk, a hollow-cheeked infantry sergeant who had fought from Tobruk to Tunisia. Or only the first night, for show? None could answer. They had been prepared for bare planks or straw, for conditions that matched the hardship they knew their civilian families faced back in Germany. Instead, they found themselves lying on beds that seemed luxurious even by pre-war German standards. Carl had fallen asleep that first night still in his clothes, too disoriented by the comfort to fully give in to it, half expecting to be rousted by shouting guards or sirens. Yet the night had passed peacefully, and morning had brought not harsher conditions, but breakfast in a mess hall with benches and tables. Now, 2 weeks into their captivity, the sheets remained. Every 7th day, American personnel would arrive with laundry carts, and the prisoners would strip their beds. The dirty linens would disappear, only to return hours later, clean, pressed, and smelling of soap powder. Some prisoners had initially refused this luxury, sleeping on bare mattresses as an act of resistance. But as days passed in the autumn chill, even the most hardened among them had succumbed to the simple comfort of clean bedding. "In Stuttgart, my mother has been using the same sheets for 3 years, Hans confided one evening, his voice low in the dimly lit barracks. "She patches them when they tear. There is no fabric to replace them, no soap to wash them properly." His eyes reflected the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. "She would not believe me if I told her that here, as a prisoner, I sleep on fresh sheets while she makes do with rags." The shame in his voice was echoed in Carl's own thoughts. They had been raised on stories of American decadence, of a soft nation that would crumble at the first sign of hardship. Yet here was evidence that even in the 4th year of global war, America could afford to give its captured enemies comforts that German civilians had long since surrendered. What did this reveal about the true state of the conflict, about the Reich's chances against such a nation? The questions were too dangerous to voice aloud, yet they hummed through the barracks each night as the prisoners settled into beds that seemed to mock everything they had been taught to believe. The contrast with their experiences in the Africa Corps was so stark as to seem almost hallucinatory. Carl remembered nights in the desert, sand working its way into every fold of clothing, every crevice of equipment. Sleep had come in brief snatches, often while sitting upright in tanks or half buried in shallow foxholes. Lice had been constant companions, along with scorpions and flies that descended in black clouds over any exposed skin. Dysentery had ravaged whole companies, men fighting with fevered determination while their bodies wasted away. Clean clothing had been a memory, clean bedding an impossible dream. "We slept in our own filth for months," Carl murmured to himself as he ran his hand over the smooth cotton sheet on his bed. "And now this." As lights out was called and the barracks fell into darkness, Carl stared up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of men around him, all nestled in clean sheets in the heart of enemy territory. Sleep came, but with it, dreams that disturbed more than they rested. Dreams of home, of his mother hanging laundry in a backyard that grew increasingly barren as the war stretched on, of his father's face growing gaunter with each passing month, and through it all, the soft whisper of clean cotton against his skin, a comfort that had become its own kind of torment. The weeks stretched into months, and as autumn deepened into winter, Carl's diary filled with observations that went far beyond the clean sheets. He noted the punctuality with which meals arrived 3 times daily, not elaborate feasts, but substantial portions of meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, served on sectioned metal trays that reminded him of school cafeterias back home. The food was plain, yet nutritious, fuel for bodies accustomed to rationing and battlefield hunger. Most striking was its reliability, the sheer predictability of American abundance compared to the increasing scarcity that letters from Germany described. "Received mail today," Carl wrote in early November. "Mother mentions soup made from boiled wallpaper paste, says it contains some nutrition from the glue. Meanwhile, I had pork, cabbage, potatoes, and bread for dinner. How do I respond to such a letter?" This question haunted many prisoners as news from home grew increasingly grim. Civilian rations in Germany had been reduced to less than 1,500 calories per day by late 1944, a slow starvation diet that left the elderly and children particularly vulnerable. Fuel shortages meant cold homes, cold baths, cold meals. Urban families burned furniture for warmth, while entire neighborhoods disappeared under Allied bombing. And yet, here in Iowa, German prisoners were housed, fed, and clothed with an efficiency that spoke of inexhaustible resources. The arrival of the first snowfall transformed the camp into a landscape of startling beauty. The barbed wire softened by white crystalline patterns, the guard towers rising like sentinels from a sea of unblemished white. Inside the barracks, cast-iron stoves radiated steady heat, fed by ample supplies of coal. Another contrast with reports from home, where German civilians huddled in unheated rooms, multiple families often sharing a single heated space to conserve fuel. The warmth of the prison barracks seemed almost obscene in its abundance, as did the extra wool blankets distributed without fanfare when temperatures dropped below freezing. "Last winter near Stalingrad," Hans told Carl one evening as they sat near the glowing stove, "we stuffed newspapers inside our uniforms for insulation. Men lost fingers, toes, ears to frostbite. Some died in their sleep, frozen solid." He gestured around the warm barracks. "Here, the Americans worry we might catch cold. They gave us these blankets without us even asking." The blankets, like the sheets, carried a message beyond mere comfort. They suggested a nation so secure in its resources that it could afford to treat enemy captives with basic humanity, a concept increasingly foreign to men raised under a regime that had systematically dehumanized its opponents. This casual provision of necessities, without propaganda announcements or expected gratitude, conveyed American confidence more effectively than any military display. Christmas brought unexpected touches of humanity to the camp. The Americans provided small luxuries, extra cigarettes, candy bars, playing cards, and permitted religious services led by a German-speaking chaplain. Some guards even joined in singing Silent Night when prisoners began the German version, Stille Nacht, during an impromptu Christmas Eve gathering. The moment of shared music across enemy lines affected many prisoners deeply, a reminder of common humanity obscured by years of propaganda and war. "I found myself standing beside an American guard, both of us singing the same melody," Otto recorded later. "For a moment, I forgot he was my enemy. Is that not strange? To share music with the man who holds the key to your cage?" Carl's diary entry that night was brief but revealing. Christmas in captivity. "Clean sheets on my bed. Warm barracks. Full stomach. My family in Stuttgart likely celebrates in a cold apartment with little food. Which of us is truly the prisoner?" The question reflected the growing moral dissonance that many prisoners experienced, a profound discomfort not at harsh treatment, but at unexpected comfort that highlighted the suffering of their families back home. Letters, censored by both American and German authorities, still hinted at deteriorating conditions: food shortages, clothing made from curtains and tablecloths, homes destroyed by bombing, relatives missing or dead. Against these accounts, the predictable routine of camp life, with its clean sheets, regular meals, and basic medical care, seemed almost luxurious. In late January, an unexpected opportunity provided Carl with a deeper glimpse into the systems that maintained this American abundance. Along with several other prisoners who had demonstrated technical aptitude, he was assigned to work detail in the camp's laundry facility, the source of those clean sheets that had so astonished him upon arrival. What he discovered there expanded his understanding of American industrial capacity in ways that military intelligence reports never could. The laundry building housed 4 massive washing machines, each capable of processing 500 pounds of fabric daily. Enormous dryers tumbled sheets, uniforms, and towels into billowing clouds of cotton, while pressing machines flattened and folded the clean linens with mechanical precision. The facility operated with only a handful of workers, mostly American civilian employees supervising prisoner labor. The entire operation produced thousands of clean items weekly, servicing not just the prisoner barracks, but the guards' quarters and administrative buildings as well. "These machines do the work of 50 women," the American supervisor explained when he noticed Carl studying the equipment. "Save time, save labor, get better results." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though industrial laundry equipment was entirely unremarkable, which, Carl realized, it probably was to an American. Working in the laundry gave Carl access to concrete numbers that found their way into his increasingly detailed diary. He noted the gallons of detergent used weekly, the pounds of fabric processed, the hours of operation, the uninterrupted supply of hot water and electricity. These figures, seemingly mundane, told a story of American industrial capacity that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about the decadent, inefficient enemy. "One washing machine cleans more sheets in an hour than my mother could in a month," he wrote. "And there are 4 of them running daily just in this camp." Multiply this by hundreds of camps, thousands of military bases, countless hospitals and hotels. This is what we are fighting against. Not just weapons, but systems, organization, efficiency on a scale we cannot match. The recognition was sobering. Carl had been raised to believe in German technical superiority, in the efficiency of the Reich's military and industrial organization. Yet here was evidence that America excelled in a form of practical innovation that prioritized results over ideology, comfort over sacrifice, abundance over scarcity. The washing machines, like the clean sheets they produced, represented a fundamentally different approach to organizing society, one that generated material well-being with seemingly effortless efficiency. As winter gave way to early spring, the camp routine continued with mechanical precision. Meals arrived at scheduled times. Showers were available weekly with hot water and soap. Medical examinations were conducted monthly. Clean sheets appeared on schedule, the laundry carts rolling through the barracks every Wednesday morning like clockwork. This predictability itself became a source of security for men whose lives had been dominated by the chaos of warfare, by desperate improvisation in the face of dwindling supplies, by the constant uncertainty of survival. "We know the Americans will feed us tomorrow," Franz observed one evening, his once hollow face now filled out after months of regular meals. "We know we will be warm. We know we will sleep on clean beds." Such certainty was rare even before my capture. The simple truth of his statement resonated among the men gathered around the barracks stove. Military life in the Wehrmacht had been increasingly defined by shortages of fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies that required constant adaptation and lowered expectations. Here in captivity, basic needs were met with a consistency that seemed almost luxurious by comparison. The prisoners had been taught to expect deprivation as a necessary sacrifice for final victory. Instead, they discovered comfort in defeat, provided by an enemy who seemed untouched by the scarcity that had dominated German life for years. Spring brought new work assignments as the Iowa farmland thawed and preparations for planting began. Prisoners were dispatched to neighboring farms under guard, repairing fences, clearing irrigation ditches, preparing soil for crops. The work was physical but not excessive, the hours reasonable, the American farmers who supervised them generally fair in their expectations. Many prisoners found themselves assigned to the same farms repeatedly, developing familiarity with both the land and its owners. Carl's work detail took him to the Anderson farm, 800 acres of prime agricultural land managed by a middle-aged couple with 2 sons serving in the Pacific. The contrast between this single-family farm and the collective agricultural villages he knew from Germany was stark. One American family controlled more land than an entire German community might farm cooperatively, and they did so with machinery that made traditional European farming methods seem medieval by comparison. The tractor, Carl wrote in his diary after his first day at the Anderson place, is larger than anything I've seen in Germany, even on showcase collective farms. It pulls a plow that cuts 6 furrows simultaneously, covering more ground in an hour than a team of horses could manage in a day. And this is not unusual. Every farm has such machines. The casual deployment of such technology for routine agricultural work suggested productive capacity far beyond anything Carl had imagined. When he mentioned this to Hans that evening, his friend nodded grimly. "I've been working at the Miller farm," Hans said. "They have a machine that sorts eggs automatically, hundreds per hour, with minimal human involvement. The farmer mentioned it was built in 1938, before the war even started." He shook his head slowly. "What chance did we ever have against a country that automated egg sorting years ago, while our farmers still use methods from the last century?" This question, "What chance did we have?" began to circulate quietly among the prisoners as evidence of American industrial and agricultural capacity became impossible to ignore. The clean sheets that had initially shocked them now seemed merely symptomatic of a deeper disparity, a fundamental mismatch between German propaganda about American weakness and the reality of American strength. The disparity was visible not in weapons or military tactics, but in washing machines, tractors, egg sorters, the mundane technologies that revealed a society organized around efficiency and abundance rather than sacrifice and scarcity. As the weather warmed, work details became longer, taking prisoners beyond the immediate vicinity of the camp and exposing them to more of rural American life. Carl found himself increasingly assigned to a regional agricultural cooperative where local farmers brought equipment for repair. The facility's workshop contained tools and spare parts in quantities that would have been unimaginable in wartime Germany, where every scrap of metal was carefully rationed and recycled. "Need to fix that tractor?" the American supervisor would say casually. "Parts are in the 3rd shelf. Help yourself." This offhand access to resources, the assumption of abundance rather than scarcity, continued to disorient Carl and his fellow prisoners. One afternoon, while repairing a harvester under the watchful but relaxed supervision of an elderly guard, Carl found himself working alongside Howard Jensen, a local mechanic who treated the German prisoner as simply another pair of hands rather than an enemy combatant. During a break, Jensen offered Carl a cold bottle of Coca-Cola from a red cooler, the gesture so natural it took Carl a moment to register its significance. "Thank you," he said hesitantly, accepting the unfamiliar bottle. The sweet, fizzy liquid was unlike anything he had tasted before, a small luxury that apparently was commonplace enough to share even with prisoners. "You're good with engines," Jensen remarked, leaning against the workbench. "What did you do before the war?" "I was studying engineering in Stuttgart," Carl replied, surprised by the casual conversation, "but only for a year before I was drafted." Jensen nodded. "Shame about the war interrupting education. My son was at Iowa State when Pearl Harbor happened. Enlisted the next day." His face showed no hostility as he mentioned this, merely the resignation of a father whose child had been pulled into the same global conflict from the opposite side. The humanizing interaction, being treated as a fellow mechanic rather than a faceless enemy, affected Carl deeply. That evening, his diary entry reflected not on washing machines or tractors, but on this moment of connection across battle lines. "The American offered me a cold drink as though I were a colleague, not a prisoner. He spoke of his son at war without hatred toward me. How far this reality is from what we were told to expect." Such encounters multiplied as spring advanced into summer. The prisoners, initially viewed with a mixture of curiosity and wariness by local communities, gradually became familiar figures in the agricultural landscape. They were still prisoners, still under guard, still the enemy, but increasingly they were also recognized as individuals, as men with skills and histories separate from the regime they had served. This subtle humanization contrasted sharply with Nazi dehumanization of opponents, another crack in the ideological foundation many prisoners had brought with them to captivity. By midsummer, news from Europe had grown increasingly grim for Germany. The Allied landings in Normandy had succeeded despite fierce resistance. Paris had been liberated. The Soviet advance continued relentlessly on the Eastern Front. Each bulletin posted in the camp's common areas drew clusters of prisoners, their expressions growing more somber with each update. The promised wonder weapons, the strategic genius of the Führer, the fanatical resistance of the Volkssturm, none seemed capable of stemming the Allied tide closing in on Germany from all directions. "It cannot all be true," insisted Franz after one particularly devastating report of German territorial losses. "They exaggerate their victories, minimize their losses. It's just more propaganda." "Like the propaganda that told us Americans were soft, undisciplined, and doomed to failure?" Hans replied quietly. "That propaganda?" He gestured around the camp at the evidence of American organization and resources that surrounded them daily. "I think we must consider the possibility that what we are hearing is true, that Germany is losing on all fronts." The recognition of Germany's impending defeat brought a new dimension to the prisoner's experience. The comfort of clean sheets, once merely disorienting, now seemed to carry a prophetic quality, an early glimpse of the vast disparity in resources and industrial capacity that was determining the war's outcome. The weekly distribution of fresh linens had become a ritual reminder of why the Reich could not ultimately prevail against such an opponent. For Karl, this understanding crystallized one July evening as he sat on his bunk, diary open on his lap, watching American personnel distribute fresh sheets throughout the barracks. The scene had become so routine that most prisoners barely acknowledged it, accepting the clean linens with the same casual expectation they now brought to regular meals and heated barracks. Yet in this very normality lay the most profound revelation. America could afford to treat enemy prisoners with basic dignity, not as a special concession, but as a matter of course, even as Germany struggled to provide its own people with life's necessities. "The true measure of a nation's strength," Karl wrote that night, "may not be found in its weapons or conquests, but in its sheets, in whether it can provide basic dignity not just to its heroes, but to its ordinary citizens, even to its enemies." It was a realization that would stay with him long after the war's end, shaping his understanding of both the conflict and its aftermath. As summer heat gave way to the first coolness of autumn, rumors of Germany's imminent collapse grew more frequent. Letters from home, heavily censored but still revealing between the lines, spoke of civilians living in cellars to avoid bombing, of food distributed in ever smaller rations, of teenagers and elderly men conscripted into last-ditch defense units. Against these accounts, the continued routine of camp life, the regular meals, medical care, and yes, the clean sheets, seemed increasingly surreal, a parallel reality disconnected from the desperate final chapter of the Third Reich. The news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Clarinda on a clear May morning in 1945. The announcement came over loudspeakers during breakfast, delivered in both English and German. The prisoners sat in stunned silence, though few showed genuine surprise. The trajectory had been clear for months, each passing week bringing reports of new defeats, lost territory, collapsing fronts. The Reich that had promised thousand-year dominance had lasted barely 12 years. In the barracks that evening, the mood was somber but not despairing. For many, the news brought a complex relief. An end to uncertainty, a conclusion to a conflict whose outcome had become increasingly obvious. They spoke quietly among themselves, not of battlefield strategies or political ideologies, but of more immediate concerns. When would they return to Germany? What would they find there? How would they rebuild lives in a defeated nation? "I don't know if my home still stands," said Hans, sitting on the edge of his bunk, shoulders slumped. "The last letter, months ago, said bombing was heavy in our district. My mother wrote from a neighbor's cellar." He smoothed the sheet beneath him with an absent gesture. "For 2 years, I've slept on clean American cotton while they huddled underground." The irony that had haunted their captivity now came full circle. They had entered these barracks as proud German soldiers, temporarily defeated but certain of their nation's ultimate triumph. They would leave as citizens of a conquered country, returning to devastation and scarcity after months of relative comfort as prisoners. The clean sheets that had first astonished them now seemed like artifacts from another world, one their homeland would not experience for years to come, if ever. The process of repatriation began slowly, with American authorities prioritizing prisoners based on a combination of factors: age, health condition, family circumstances, and political screening to identify those with deeper Nazi affiliations. Karl found himself in an intermediate category, neither among the first to depart nor the last to be held for extended screening. As weeks passed and others began to leave, the camp gradually emptied. Barracks were decommissioned, work details reduced. Through it all, the remaining amenities continued: regular meals, medical care, and laundry service, the camp administration maintaining standards until the final prisoner departed. Karl had begun to prepare himself psychologically for return to a defeated Germany. American orientation sessions provided some information about conditions he might expect: food shortages, housing crises, occupation zones divided among Allied powers, denazification procedures, restricted movement. The contrast with his prisoner experience would be stark, a reversal of the shock he had experienced upon arrival in America. He had entered captivity expecting deprivation and discovered comfort. He would leave comfort to enter deprivation. On his last night in Camp Clorinda, Karl lay awake longer than usual, conscious of the clean sheet beneath him, the soft pillow, the wool blanket. Tomorrow he would board a train that would eventually lead to a ship, returning him to a Germany now divided among occupying powers. The contrast with the order and abundance of his prison camp would be severe, a reality he had accepted intellectually but could scarcely imagine emotionally. "Are you awake?" Hans whispered from the next bunk, one of the few familiar faces still remaining as the repatriation process continued. "Yes," Karl replied, "thinking about tomorrow. And about what we'll tell them, back home, when they ask what it was like here." The question hung in the darkness. What would they say about these months as American prisoners? About the clean sheets, the adequate food, the heated barracks in winter? How could they describe this experience to families who had endured bombing, hunger, and fear? "I'll tell them the truth," Karl said finally, "that America won because it could give even its enemies what Germany couldn't provide its own people." He paused, hand resting on the smooth cotton beneath him. "That I learned more about why we lost the war from these sheets than from any battle." Hans was silent for a long moment before responding. "They may not want to hear such truths. Not yet. Perhaps not ever." "Nevertheless," Karl said, "it is what I know now." When dawn came, Karl rose and made his bed one final time, stretching the sheet tight, folding the blanket with precision. It was a small gesture of acknowledgement, a farewell to the comfort that had become both luxury and burden during his captivity. As he smoothed the white cotton surface, memories flooded back. That first night of disbelief, the gradual acceptance, the growing understanding of what these simple linens revealed about two nations at war. His fingers lingered on the fabric, committing its texture to memory before turning away. The journey back to Germany proved every bit as disorienting as his arrival in America had been, though in reverse. The prisoners traveled by train across an American landscape untouched by bombing, through towns with lit windows and stocked shops, past farms where machinery hummed in fields golden with wheat. At the eastern seaport, they boarded ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, no longer as soldiers, but as defeated men returning to a conquered homeland. Even on these transports, American provisions continued: adequate food, medical attention, and clean bedding in the ship's converted cargo holds. As European shores appeared on the horizon, a strange quiet fell over the German passengers. The continent they had left as conquering warriors now awaited them as a shattered landscape divided among victorious powers. Reports from advance parties confirmed their worst fears: cities reduced to rubble, transportation networks destroyed, Civilians living in makeshift shelters amid the ruins of what had once been neighborhoods. The clean sheets of Camp Clorinda seemed increasingly like a dream from which they were about to awaken into harsh reality. The contrast when they finally disembarked into the ruins of Hamburg was more shocking than Karl had prepared himself to expect. The great port city lay in devastation, entire districts reduced to skeletal remnants of buildings. People moved like ghosts through the rubble, thin faces and threadbare clothing telling the story of Germany's defeat more eloquently than any news bulletin. The processing center for returning prisoners was efficient but sparse. Basic documentation, minimal supplies, instructions for travel to hometowns if they still existed. No clean sheets awaited them here, no predictable meals, no heated barracks. Reality had reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Karl made his way south toward Stuttgart, traveling through a landscape transformed by war. Bombed rail lines, collapsed bridges, fields untended due to lack of manpower or equipment. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of the gulf between American abundance and German devastation. His diary entries during this journey were sparse but revealing. Slept in train station with 50 others, no beds, no blankets, cold. And later, found family home partially standing, mother alive, father missing since March. One room habitable, no sheets on beds, no beds at all really. We sleep on floor with coats for blankets. The reality of post-war Germany made his memories of Camp Clorinda seem almost hallucinatory, a strange interlude of comfort in a world dominated by hardship. Yet Karl clung to those memories, not as nostalgia for captivity, but as evidence of what was possible, of how societies could function when organized around production rather than destruction, comfort rather than sacrifice, abundance rather than scarcity. The clean sheets had been more than a luxury. They had been a glimpse of a different way of ordering human affairs. As Germany slowly rebuilt under occupation, fragmented into East and West by the emerging Cold War, Karl watched with particular attention to the material conditions of daily life. The contrast between the American sector and those controlled by other powers told its own story about different approaches to governance and resource allocation. In the American zone, washing machines began to appear in public laundries. Stores gradually restocked. Electricity became reliable. The clean sheets of Camp Clorinda no longer seemed like an impossible luxury, but a standard that might eventually be attained again in civilian life. Years later, when Karl had established himself as a teacher in West Germany, he sometimes told his students about his time as an American prisoner. The stories often met with disbelief that enemy captives had received amenities unavailable to German civilians, that Americans had provided comfort when they could have chosen punishment. Some accused him of exaggerating, of romanticizing his captivity, of diminishing the suffering of those who had remained in Germany during the bombing and invasion. "I understand your doubt," he would tell them. "I too wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't lived it. But this is why America won. Not just because of weapons or strategy, but because of washing machines and clean sheets. Because their system could produce abundance even in wartime, while ours produced only scarcity and sacrifice." This lesson, that societies reveal their true character not through proclamations or pageantry, but through their capacity to provide for basic human needs, became central to Karl's understanding of history. The Reich had promised glory while failing to deliver necessities. America had demonstrated power through something as mundane as clean cotton, laundered weekly without fail. In his classroom, without directly referencing his personal experience, Karl encouraged his students to look beyond rhetoric to evidence, beyond claims to demonstrable realities. "Ask practical questions," he would tell them. "Who has enough to eat? Who sleeps in comfort? Who lives without fear of midnight knocks on the door?" These daily realities tell you more about a society than any speech or parade. Some evenings, sitting in his comfortable apartment in rebuilt Stuttgart, Karl would run his hand over the clean sheets of his bed, remembering that first night of captivity when similar fabric had seemed like an incomprehensible luxury. The memory no longer carried the sting of shame or the weight of revelation. Instead, it had become a reference point, a reminder of how far Germany had come from defeat to renewal, and of the fundamental lesson he had learned behind American barbed wire. The true measure of a nation was not in its conquests or its ideologies, but in its sheets, in the basic dignity it could provide not just to its heroes, but to its ordinary citizens, even to its enemies. This understanding had begun in confusion on a prisoner's bunk in Iowa, but it had matured into wisdom that guided his life in a Germany slowly recovering its place in the community of nations. As decades passed and the war receded into history, Karl occasionally encountered other former prisoners from American camps. Regardless of where they had been held, camps in Kansas, Texas, Wisconsin, their stories contained the same notes of initial disbelief at their treatment, the same gradual recognition of what American abundance revealed about the true balance of power. And almost always, somewhere in their accounts, there would be mention of the sheets, clean, white, changed regularly, that had become symbolic of everything they had not expected. "We were prepared for cruelty," an elderly veteran told Karl at a reunion in the 1970s. "We had been told Americans were savages who would torture us. Instead, they gave us beds with sheets." He shook his head, still marveling at the memory. "I realized then that everything I had been taught was backwards. A nation that gives clean sheets to prisoners is not the barbarian. The barbarian is the one who tells such lies about his enemies." Karl nodded, recognizing his own journey in the man's words. They had all entered captivity as products of a system that thrived on enemies, on hatred, on fear of the other. They had departed as reluctant witnesses to a different reality, one where the supposed enemy had revealed its character not through propaganda, but through practical provision, through the simple dignity of clean cotton against skin. On summer evenings, when the windows of his apartment stood open to catch the breeze, Karl would sometimes watch his grandchildren playing in the courtyard below. Children born into a Germany that took clean sheets for granted, that had no memory of defeat or occupation, that belonged to a Europe slowly knitting itself together after centuries of conflict. They would never fully understand what he had learned in that Iowa camp, how a simple comfort had undermined a lifetime of certainties. Perhaps that was as it should be. The lesson of the sheets was one that each generation must learn anew, that societies reveal themselves not through grand declarations, but through daily provisions, that true strength lies not in conquest, but in the capacity to create systems that sustain rather than destroy, that offer dignity rather than deprivation. Have we not all, at some point, judged cultures and governments by the comforts they provide or withhold, by how they treat the least among them rather than the greatest? In the end, the white cotton that had so disoriented Karl in his first days of captivity had illuminated truths that would guide his understanding long after the war had faded into history. The clean sheets of Camp Clarinda had been his first step on a journey from certainty to questioning, from acceptance to understanding, a journey that had ultimately led him not back to the Reich's illusions, but forward into a clearer vision of what truly constitutes a society worth building.